is a masterclass by author and historian Devika Rangachari, wherein she'll look at women who carved a niche for themselves as described in traditional Indian texts that go back 100 years or hundreds of years, along with a richly detailed Queen's series of historical fiction, Queen of Ice, Queen of Earth, Queen of Fire. The author invites us to see that while these accounts may be from an era far removed from our own, the stories continue to resonate with us. Devika Rangachari is an award-winning writer whose book Queen of Ice by Duckbill was on the White Raven list, won the Neve Young Adult Book Award, was shortlisted for the Sahitya Akademi's Bal Sahitya Puraskar, and has been optioned to be made into a movie or television series. Her other books include Queen of Fire, which was a Parag Honor List 2022, Queen of Earth, Parag Honor List 2021, shortlisted for the Neve and JK Author Awards. The Train to Tanjore, 10 Indian monarchs whose amazing stories you may not know, Tale of Love and Adventure, Swami Vivekanand, A Man with a Vision, Harshavardhana, The Merry Mischief of Gopal Bhand, The Wit of Tenali Raman, and Growing Up. Devika has also completed her postdoctoral research on gender in Indian history. Please give it up for Devika Rangachari.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to take you on a sort of whirlwind tour of my books in the Queen series and perhaps a couple of others to show you how I use historical sources to resurrect certain figures from the past. Before I begin, let me just ask you this, because out of curiosity's sake, how many of you are here because you really want to know how to write historical fiction, which I suppose is the purpose of this masterclass, and how many of you are here okay, so a few of you, all right. So let me tell you, those of you who actually do want to write historical fiction, you don't have to be a historian to write historical fiction. You don't have to specialize and study history all your life and end up with a whole string of degrees in the way I have done. You just need to have a keen interest in the past. That is enough, usually. But then, what you cannot avoid is the research, because the one slightly annoying factor of writing historical fiction, which distinguishes it from any other kind of fiction that you're writing, is that it has to be accurate. So it cannot all come out of your head. It cannot all be, your imagination. And the other problem when you're writing historical fiction is that most people, as I said, find history incredibly boring. When I go to schools to do sessions on any other kind of writing, and I mention the word history, I see looks of dismay and, total consternation and the whole thing about why are we doing this? This is the most boring subject. We don't like learning facts. We can't pronounce the names, and, what is the point, and so on and so forth. And the point, as I always say, is that you need to know where you came from in order to know who you are. And that is actually the most important part of history. It's like you need to know what to do with those 26 letters of the alphabet before you can start writing a book. It's as simple as that. You have to have this basis, and then you build on that. But having said that, if you've chosen to write historical fiction, it is going to be one of the toughest things you do the further back in time you set your story. So for instance, if you think, oh my God, like I should set my story in the time of the Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, that sounds really exotic, and everyone is going to want to read my books. The first obstacle you will immediately stumble upon is that you do not have sources. Or you do not have sources that actually speak to you in a manner that is going to make any sense. And the further back in time you go, say you get to the old Stone Age, or basically the Stone Age, the old, new, middle, whichever one, there you run into a worse problem, because that is actually what is called prehistory, before there was any writing. And for all practical purposes, even the Harappan civilization is prehistory, because although it is actually proto-history, because we have written records, we do not know the script. So it is as good as not having any written sources. So it is better, if you want to start writing historical fiction, to base your story on something that you can actually access and see and understand, and probably not do what I have done, because I've also based a lot of my stories in a time period for which the sources are barely there. So I'm not just a historian when I'm writing, I'm also a detective trying to cover up certain holes in my knowledge, and I'm also a psychologist, because I need to know how people behaved and thought and so on and so forth, and put myself into different people's shoes and so on. So it's not a question of this is between me and my writing style, I will sort of make this wonderful story come alive. It's about you donning several hats at the same time and trying to pull off a story without too many sources, and which will not have people running at you and saying, look, this is nonsense, this can't have happened, and this is completely inaccurate, and this is just doesn't pass for history. So I'm going to just tell you about a little bit about how I wrote this book, Queen of Ice. Queen of Ice, for those of you who haven't read the book, is about Didda, who ruled Kashmir in the 10th century for around 50 years, 25 as informal ruler and 25 as formal ruler, and who was one of the toughest and strongest rulers that Kashmir has ever known, and who also managed to give Kashmir a period of peace and prosperity that it never saw before or since. But the minute I decided to work on her for my doctoral thesis, this is when I said, oh, let me just look at women from my PhD research, and I immediately drew a blank, because all the narratives that I read on Kashmir had only two things to say or not say about Didda. One was this silence, wherein Didda was not mentioned. So there were these 50 missing years where there was just mention of men who ruled before her or after her, and there's this curious gap. So immediately you start wondering what on earth happened in that period. Or I would routinely come up against statements like, yes, there was this woman ruler called Didda, but my God, she was a woman ruler. Like, should a woman actually be wanting to rule? So clearly she was more a man than a woman. And in that case, should we not examine her morals? Did she go to temples? Did she pray? Was she of good character? Now, let me tell you that all through history, when you're reading historical narratives, there are always two standards for judging male and female rulers. The men will always be judged by their contributions towards extending the kingdom, towards fighting battles, towards building structures. It doesn't matter how many people they killed in the process, or what blood and gore they resorted to in the process, but that is what contributes to their glory. But the minute a woman figure emerges, it is immediately about their religion or their good character and their morals, and all about, was she kind? Nobody asks if a king was kind, but that question will definitely be asked of a queen. Was she kind? Was she generous? Was she pious? Did she do enough for the cause of humanity? And so on and so forth. Why is it relevant in today's day and age? Because you just need to look at the newspapers to know these are exactly the standards that are still used to judge prominent men and women figures of today. So the man can literally get away with murder in all senses of the word. The woman can't. The woman needs to be seen as a family person. Yeah, she might be a very great politician, but does she look after her children? Does she cook at home? Does she do all that, and so on and so forth? So as you can see, what was happening all those years ago has a direct resonance on today's day and age. So what are the sources for Didda? Once I discovered that there was a problem and that was a woman who existed and that I needed to uncover her history, what I immediately understood was that she did issue inscriptions that have barely survived. She did issue coins that have barely survived. Some of them are badly damaged, so that even if they're there, you don't understand what's written on them. But then you have this text called the Raj Tarangini, which just translated means River of Kings. And it is a 12th century text written by this person called Kalhana, who decided in the 12th century that he was going to be a historian, and he was going to chronicle Kashmir's history, and he decided to do it in the time-honored way of all historians, which is to see what have other historians done before me. So he actually went and looked up buildings, coins, inscriptions, texts, everything so that he could get an authentic history out. And ironically, you cannot actually attempt a history of Kashmir without reading his text. And he is the only source for Didda's rule. Also, he doesn't just talk about Didda's rule, he talks about some other women rulers, and I'm not going to tell you about them because they're going to be probably, hopefully, the subject of my next books in the Queen series. So I'm not going to tell you anything about them. Thank you. But here we come back to Didda. But here I found a really interesting piece of evidence related to Didda that actually tied up beautifully with what Kalhana said in his text, which just shows you how important it is to have, that conjunction of the written word and the actual evidence. So, Didda actually marries the king of Kashmir, called Shemagupta, moves to Kashmir, and then her husband is so fascinated by her that he just leaves everything to her, including running the kingdom, including running his life. And he's anyway quite a useless character, so she decides that, I might as well take up the rulership, and she does it. So that's where her 25 informal years start as ruler behind the throne. Now, he actually was so fascinated by her that the public at large knew that this was the case, this was the state of affairs. And they actually used to call him by this nickname, which had both their names combined. So it's a bit like today's Will Cat or Brangelina or whatever, modern, those names that you have where, a very beloved couple is sort of called by this very endearing nickname. So he was known as Didak Shema to the public at large, Didda and Shemagupta, Didak Shema. And the man was so besotted that he actually issued a whole series of Didak Shema coins, which is actually still available if any of you want to go to Srinagar today and go to the SPS museum. You actually see the coins there, and it's a different kind of thrill altogether to see those coins with Didak Shema written on them and actually know that what Kalhana was talking about in the 12th century and what she actually did in the 10th century is right there before your eyes in this century. So that was really thrilling. As I said, there is not much known about her. She is supposed to have built 64 buildings, none of which have survived. So you can't even go around looking for structures that, she might have built. And of course, a lot of historians have used this evidence that she built 64 buildings to say, oh my God, she built a lot of religious structures, which means at least, even though she killed a lot of people to get to the throne, at least she prayed. But actually, she named all those religious structures and, in fact, secular structures after herself. So that, they all had her name Didda in it, so that she ensured that even after she died, she would be known on the landscape forever. So, a very clever woman, very ambitious, very strong, very powerful, and that is the reason why she has basically been made invisible in histories of today. So I actually, to write her story, it was a minefield to just steer away from all the negative information that I had about her being horrible and actually not a woman. And try and write this for women, for children, young adults. When I say young adults, it can be read by anybody. I don't just restrict it to young adults. But there again, I ran into an immediate problem, which a lot of you will face if you want to write historical fiction, and some of you did raise your hands, which is you will immediately run into the gatekeepers the minute you start writing historical fiction in a more forceful way than you would if you wrote a story from your imagination. Because your imagination can't really be contested. It came from your mind, your It's your story. But the problem about history is, and I think this is probably true of every country in the world, history is seen as belonging to everyone. Now, some of us would not dare to make assumptions about the field of physics or chemistry unless you actually have some background knowledge in the field or you have some kind of expertise. So you would probably steer clear of those fields and say, leave it to the experts. Unfortunately, that is not the case with history, because everybody has an opinion on everything that happened in the past, and I have all these years, despite my having actually studied the discipline, and actually it's a pretty rigorous discipline, you go through years of training to know how to approach a source and how to get information out of it. But I've been routinely told facts about the past that people know, but that I don't know. That, if I say something, oh, this happened, I'm told, no, you don't know. This is actually what happened. So history is the kind of subject that raises a lot of passions and a lot of questions and a lot of anger among a lot of people. So if you're going to want to write historical fiction, be aware of that. Not everybody is going to like what you write. A lot of people are going to actively hate it, and you must be prepared for that. I ran into another issue here right away because I made no attempt to whitewash Didda's personality and character. She was extremely ruthless, she was extremely ambitious, and she had no problem in indulging a lot of blood and gore to get to the throne, because in her mind, she was the best suited to rule that throne in order to give Kashmir some kind of stability. And she actually did, which is, of course, besides the point here. But I have run into a lot of librarians, and I apologize if there are librarians sitting here in this audience who have immediately told me, but we can't let our 15-year-olds read this book. There is violence in it. And I have struggled to always give the diplomatic answer, which is, yes, but this is history. You cannot wish it away. This actually happened. And so if you can actually read about Ashoka, the Mauryan ruler, indulging in blood and gore and the Battle of Kalinga, and still talk about him with a lot of respect and reverence today, then you can jolly well read about Didda and learn what she did. Also, I think a lot of adults regularly underestimate the intelligence of children. The fact that they read means that there is a certain amount of intelligence and discernment right there. You do not have to stand between them and the written word and say that they need to be shielded. No, they do not need to be shielded. They are exposed to far worse on social media, and in fact, you actually don't have any qualms in letting them see whatever they want on TV or on whatever computer games and so on. So there are a few double standards here, but anyway, that is besides the point. So then I had to write this in a way that I initially thought, I can't write all the facts, everybody's going to get upset. But then I had this wonderful publisher, who unfortunately is not here today, who said, just go ahead and write it. We will market the book. And they actually did that, and it's done very well, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm very grateful to a lot of you who've loved the book, and, thank you so much. But to write this book was tough, because as I said, I had barely any sources. There's a lot of guesswork involved in reconstructing her life. I also had to do it in a way that seemed logical. I could not just invent things. It had to be accurate or near accurate. It had to be something that would have actually happened at that time. And I also complicated matters a bit by writing in the first person to bring me close to the main character. So I actually had to get inside Didda's head and then write about her. Could I have the next slide, please? This book was even tougher. This book is called Queen of Earth, and this was a century before Didda. This is the 9th century in Orissa, or Odisha as is known today, in the east. And this is about Prithvi Mahadevi, who ruled what is called the Bhaumakara dynasty of Orissa in the 9th century for a certain period of time. And it's very interesting, the circumstances by which she became the ruler. She actually belonged to a neighboring kingdom, but her father conquered the Bormokara throne and put her on the throne. Now, she was not a puppet ruler by any means because she maintained herself on the throne in a very intelligent manner. Um, and as with Didda, had to deal with a male-dominated environment, so had to deal with a lot of men who were trying to throw her off the throne and get to it themselves. But she managed to leave a mark in the history of Orissa in a very remarkable way. But again, as with Didda, either she is not there in narratives of Orissa, or if she is mentioned, it is always in a paragraph titled Downfall of the Bormokara Dynasty, and it's, look, a woman's on the throne. That means it's the end. So, and of course, there were a lot of women rulers who came after her. There were actually 6 women rulers of the Bormokaras who ruled in succession. So somebody's daughter, somebody's aunt, somebody's, so on and so forth. And of course, the dynasty did end, as all dynasties do. It had very little to do with the women being involved, but she is seen as starting the downfall because she was a woman who dared to rule. Again, I do not need to repeat the relevance in modern times. You just need to pick up today's newspaper or any analysis of any women politicians or any remarkable women anywhere in the world, and you will see a version of this staring right back at you. So with Prithvi Mahadevi, there is virtually nothing. She issued 2 inscriptions during her rule, both of which was donating land to another woman, and we don't know who this woman was. And then there are stray sentences in the annals of other dynasties from which we reconstruct her rule. But then, those 2 inscriptions that she issued, they point to her being extremely clever and shrewd, which actually helped me write her character to a very large extent. There were actually other male heirs to the Bormokara throne. The previous ruler had died leaving 2 sons behind, either of which could have occupied the throne and challenged her rule. But she issues this inscription, a very public record, and says, there are no heirs left. The previous man died childless. Therefore, I'm the only one who's left to rule this throne. And so that was a very clever way of immediately getting rid of all opposition and making sure nobody challenged her rule. So there were these huge hints right there that made me think about where did she get this information and this kind of shrewdness from. What made her think this way? What made her actually take this very bold step? Who was this woman she was issuing, land to? What was going on? And that's how I reconstructed this entire story. Again, not a job for the faint-hearted, because you have to write 40,000 words based on nothing or very little. So it's tough again. Again, I would like to thank all those who liked this book and actually found the story plausible, although I left it on a rather ambiguous note because nobody knows what happened to her. She just disappeared. So another way of writing historical fiction, again, I had no text to deal with. The subject of this masterclass, how do you mine historical texts? In every period that you look at in the past, you don't always get texts or the amount of information that you want to consult. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, I'm widening the title a little here because it's supposed to be how do you mine ancient text. Queen of Fire is about a very, very well-known figure who does not inhabit the ancient realm, but rather a very well-known realm. This is Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, who fought against the British in the 19th century and was very well known as one of the first freedom fighters or mutineers against the British colonial regime. Now here I had a very different kind of problem. All of you know about Rani Lakshmibai. Everybody's sitting here because you've all been taught about her in schools, in textbooks, that's all you read about. She will be written about routinely during Independence Day, during Republic Day, whatever. But then the other problem exists. There is too much information on her, and all the information makes her into a superhero. You know, a woman who can do no wrong, who is like this warrior goddess, who knew exactly what she wanted to do, and she achieved success in every step that she took, and the British were frustrated. Yes, the British were frustrated, but it is not because she was a larger than life superhero. No. My job in this book was actually to look at a very different angle of Rani Lakshmibai, which is her as a human being, just a woman, a very young woman at that, in her early 20s, who is subject to all the normal human fears and frailties. The knowledge that Jhansi, the kingdom she ruled, was a very tiny one against the might of the British. The fact that every step she took might endanger the entire population of Jhansi, and so on and so forth. So it is ridiculous to think that she actually got up every morning and said, yeah, now I know exactly, like, this is what I'm going to do, and this is going to send the British running. No way. Of course she had second thoughts. Of course she second-guessed herself. Of course she was terrified. Courage has nothing to do with it. Of course she was courageous. Nobody's doubting that. But this is what happens all too often, again, in modern prominent women figures in today's day. They are either very ordinary figures who are not worthy of mentioning, or they are superheroes, supergirls, superwomen. There is no in-between. Whereas, as we know, all of us inhabit the in-between. But there is no talk of that space. Whereas men will have different categories of, this is an ordinary man, that is a slightly extraordinary man, this man is a non-royal, but he is like this, that is a royal man, etc., etc. So as you can see, there is a tendency to usually lump all women together. And again, there are echoes of the superwoman. In any prominent public woman figure of today, it will be, yes, she is making policies for the country, but is her home life good? Is she actually supervising her children's homework? There is your superhero right there. So here, there is too much material. There is archival material. There are journal entries. There are British documents. There's everything possible. And I was just trying to resurrect or remove the woman who's been buried underneath all this. I also focused on another not very well-known aspect of her life, which is the relationship that she had with her adopted son. Now, as most of you might know, Rani Lakshmibai lost her son when he was an infant. She adopted a boy called Damodar in order to have what she thought was a legitimate heir to her throne after she went, but the British refused to recognize him. And most of her battle was to make sure that they recognized him. So my whole focus was, what is the relationship between these two? There's this boy coming from somewhere, and she has to actually forge a bond with him. Does she like this boy? Does a boy like this whole business of leaving behind his parents and moving into a palace environment and having this person as a new mother and trying to deal with all that? So that was what Queen of Fire was all about, just trying to remove all the facts, or rather, no, it is very factual, remove all the dull and exaggerated fact from the actually remarkable but ordinary woman that she was. Could I have the next slide, please? This one. I wanted to talk to you about this book called Harshavardhana, although I don't think, I'm not sure it's in print, and I'm not sure whether any of you read this book. This, by the way, is not what Harshavardhana looked like, but as those of you know who are in the business of writing books for children, it is the publisher who decides what should be on the cover of your book. And so this apparently was supposed to be attractive enough for readers to pick up the title. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of Harshavardhana of Kannauj. Kannauj still exists. It's in North India. You can look it up on the map. Now, he is always known as Harsha of Kannauj or Harshavardhana of Kannauj, because to rule Kannauj in the 7th century meant that you ruled all of North India, because Kannauj was so powerful. But what your history textbooks will never tell you, or your general histories will never tell you, is that he got the throne of Kannauj through his younger sister, another woman who's been completely written out of history. Her name was Rajyashree. her husband actually ruled Kannauj and he was murdered, but Harsha needed her by his side to stake his claim to the throne. There are Chinese contemporary accounts that say that she actually ruled the throne jointly with him. There are accounts of her participating in court debates, accompanying him on military campaigns. But this woman is treated in two ways again, the same kinds of ways. One is, I don't know if you've read the Amar Chitrakatha version of Harsha. Please do today, just as a general exercise in curiosity. So in that, she's portrayed as somebody who's weeping and fainting and just so completely helpless, and Harsha has to keep propping her up and saying, don't worry, I will make decisions on your behalf. I will, I am there for you. I am the strong one. She was probably the stronger of the two. Harsha is also known for being of having changed to Buddhism at some point, patronizing Buddhism in a very big way. She was actually a Buddhist before him, so she could have very well influenced his religious choices as well. Another thing that's not mentioned. Or she's not mentioned at all because she's considered completely unnecessary to the whole narrative of Harsha. And of course, Harsha very cleverly does not mention her in any of the inscriptions that he issues, because obviously he doesn't want to show that the grand Harsha of Kannauj is actually dependent on a woman to get him there in the first place. I think that's about it. That's what I wanted to say, in how to resurrect again with Harsha. There are inscriptions that he issued which do not mention Rajashri. So if I'm actually talking about Rajashri, I need to go to a completely different source, which is the Chinese accounts. I don't know how many of you remember your history school textbooks. You always have to learn these names of the two Chinese pilgrims who came and visited India and left behind accounts. So this was the second of the two who came, Xuanzang, who left behind his account. And he is a marvelous source on Rajashri, which no real Indian historian is willing to pick up or comment on. So when you're looking at the subject today, mining ancient historical texts for today's day and age, mining history writing is a minefield, if I may expand that term. And you do not always find texts. I would have loved to have a text for Prithvi Mahadevi and to write Queen of Earth. There was nothing. There was what is called nowadays radio silence. Nothing about her. So, and it's not just a problem of looking at ancient texts, it is also a problem of looking at quite contemporary texts. Also, may I also gently remind most people here, most adults here, when you're looking at texts, history is definitely not mythology, it is not legend, it is history. History is fact. So mythology might represent some elements of truth, it is not the whole truth. So do not please pick up some text that is some whatever legend which has come down over the 1,000 years. Yes, of course, every text reflects the society in which it was created, but it cannot be read as, oh my God, it was written in the 7th century AD. This is exactly what happened in the 7th century AD. No. So it's just that. So I think I'm going to end here and ask if you have any questions on history, on the writing, or generally. Yes? I think somebody has a mic.
Hi, I'm Akhila.
Hi, Akhila.
Just wanted to know what period of history do you think is least represented in historical fiction? Because I see a lot of people writing and trying to write historical fiction nowadays in different ways, but are there areas you think that are or dark at the moment?
There are huge areas that are lying unrepresented, like what you call a huge chronological expanse, simply because nobody is going to venture there unless you're a historian yourself. And you know exactly where these sources are, and you know exactly what pertains to this period. So if those of you who do not have a background in history and want to write, by all means write. But just be aware that all too often there is a tendency to write a lot about the freedom struggle because it's easy in a way. You have access to a lot of documentation. um, and maybe even living sources if you're lucky. Um, but nobody really goes back in time. Yes, a few have ventured into the Stone Age category, but I'm not going to name any book but a lot of historical fiction in the market today is historical imagination. It is not actually too much fact. Ideally, it should be a blend of fact and fiction. And usually the fiction is what is there. And there is a lot of very arbitrary fact that usually, just passes, it's there, but the fiction also passes for fact because most people do not know. And even if a historian is reading it, that person is not going to go and trace the author and say, hey, listen, people weren't eating this in that day and age, so you cannot write this here. So a lot of it is just, just general power. So there are huge areas that are lying unexplored. And if you're looking at gender, for example, almost all of it is unexplored. So, yeah, there's a lot of potential there for anybody who wants to get into that realm. Any other questions? Yeah?
Hi, Devika. It's a beautiful article what you've written.
Sorry, I can't hear
You have written a beautiful article. I was just seeing how you explain. My question is very simple, right? History is mystery or fact?
History is mystery or?
Of fact.
History is mystery of fact.
Fact, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Did you say history is mystery or fact, or history is mystery of fact? Or fact.
Yeah.
Okay, let's not fool ourselves here. History is fact. Okay, you cannot get away from it. It is fact. Having said that, there is no such thing as an objective fact, because between you and the fact is me, the historian. And I am going to influence you in the way I want to, because it depends on what I am looking at when I see a source. Let me just give you the example I gave you earlier of the Didak Shema coin. So if I look at the Didak Shema coin, and I'm a historian who is not particularly interested in women, but I'm interested in economic history, I could say, oh, this was the denomination at that time. This was the mode of currency. This was the metal that it was made out of. And so much of this was, equal to that much of that. But if I'm a gender historian and I'm looking at the Didak Shema coin, I couldn't care less about the denomination and what it represented. For me, it is, oh my God, here is this man who is so influenced by his wife that he's documenting her name in a very public manner, and acknowledging the fact that the public call him by this name. This is important for me as a gender historian. You, as a reader, will not know any of the turmoil that went into the historian's mind when I'm presenting the fact to you. You will not know, because you do not know what I am thinking of when I'm looking at a source. So while I say history is fact, it is actually fact minus historian coming in, what is left. So we try to be as objective as possible, but historians are not saints. So yeah, that is the way it is. So it is mystery in as much as a lot of it is mystery, because you still have to uncover a lot of sources, but one hopes that the demystification and whatever will keep going on, and we'll get to uncover more and more phases of the past as we go along.
I'll ask the next question. I wanted to ask, when you write a historical fiction, how much of fact do you keep and how much of fiction? Where do you draw the line exactly, and how do you decide that? And the second question I wanted to ask is that how do we as readers educate ourselves to look at historical fiction in a more knowledgeable manner, as you were referring to?
Okay, so very interesting questions. The first one, I'm one of those kind of panic-stricken historians who feel that I cannot convey an irresponsible version of the past, because I know what the past is, or my portion of the past that I've specialized in. So while I write fiction, I do not create too many imaginary characters. In fact, I hardly create any imaginary characters. So mostly all the characters in my books are based on people who are actually documented as having existed. So even if they're talked about very fleetingly. Those of you who've read Queen of Ice know that a very important person in the book is Valga, who's Didda's companion. Now, she is the subject of one verse in the Raj Tarangini as having been powerful enough to build a certain structure. And from that, I have reconstructed her story as in how was she powerful enough to reach that point. So, but she existed. So I can't, I don't want to run the risk of having some reader come up to me and say, no, but then did this not exist? And then being totally betrayed that actually this did not exist or this person did not exist. So I'm very careful. I make sure. So even if my books have fewer characters, I prefer it that way because I don't want to, invent too many. How do you as readers educate yourselves? To just, give historical fiction its due. Because a lot of the time, a lot of grown-ups tell children, a lot of them steer them away from reading fiction as they go, towards higher and higher classes in school, which is, of course, a horrible mistake, but that's a subject for another discussion altogether. But a lot of parents encourage children to read historical fiction because this is going to help you score more marks in your history exam at the end of the year. No, it might not. Just because a child is learning about Indian history does not mean you should stop that child from reading about Egyptian history or whatever they want to read about. The whole point is to appreciate that history is a very interesting story. And so the more they read, the more interested they're going to get in the subject. And you as grown-up readers, if you are interested in it, just go and read up more actually. If you're interested in Queen of Ice, for instance, in that period, just read up narratives set in that period or that even today talk of that period and see, do they mention these women at all? How do they mention these figures? And what exactly did Didda do? Because I had to compress about 1 million facts on her into, again, 40,000 words. So I have left out a lot of very interesting things about her. So if you really want to know, go read up and, and that way you will get to read about more interesting people, and you can just, the journey is endless. You can just go on and on, educating yourselves. So it never ends. Any other questions?
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
So it is somewhat similar to what she asked, but probably not, I don't know. To what extent is your interpretation of a historical character influenced by your reading or experience with the real characters around you or in newspapers? And if that is the case, then to what extent could you say that this character is historical and not real?
So when I write, I consciously steer away from having any kind of parallels with the way modern or contemporary people are written about. That doesn't enter my mind at all, because that too, when you write historical fiction, in your mind you have to move back to that space. So you're immediately talking about a different context, a different way of living, different terms, different social mores. And as I said, I usually write in first person, which means I actually have to be that person. So I can't actually carry any modern parallels or resonances in my head. It's only after I've written it, and then maybe then it strikes me that, this is probably very similar to some contemporary character and so on. So I try and stay away from that. I can't answer for other writers of historical fiction. Maybe their process is different, but that's my process. I think you wanted to ask something? No, did she want? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So in the Queen of Ice story, you said there was someone who was not like, she was more than a boy than a girl. What does that mean?
Okay. Have you heard this? Have you heard this term tomboy? You know what that means, right? So a girl who's doing things that are stereotypically meant for boys. So this might be a girl who likes playing sport, who doesn't like to do what is girly things. So this is what is called stereotypes, which is a way of labeling or, assigning certain things to certain people on the basis of a lot of bias, I would say. Because, there are lots of girls, I'm sure you know, who love to play sports. You probably like playing games. you might hate to play with dolls. But when normally a lot of people say girls like to play with dolls, they don't like to play sports. But if you're a girl who likes to play sport, therefore you're a tomboy. This is pretty much that. It's a bigger version of that, where a woman is actually, a girl when she grows up is supposed to be very much keeping her family and the home as the focus and not anything too much outside of it. So if in that age a young girl is actually, she wants to rule, she wants to sit on a throne, that is seen as something which should only be for boys or young men. So that's why she's seen as more of a man than a woman, which she definitely was not. She was a very, she had no qualms about calling herself a woman. Here, let me mention another thing. A lot of you have heard of Razia Sultan, I think, who dressed as a man in order to gain public acceptance, as if to say, yes, I'm ruling, I am a woman, but I'm actually a man because I'm dressing like a man. Didda had no qualms about saying, I am a woman, and I am not, because she used both male and female titles in her coins and her inscriptions. So she's a clever woman trying to, confuse the population that, yeah, I am a man, I'm also a woman. So, it's like this. So she had no problems about saying I'm a woman. So it was right there. I think we have 5 minutes. This person, I think probably we have time for one more question.
Hello. Oh, hi. Hi, Devika.
Hi.
I love what you're doing. I'm
Thank you.
Big fan of historical fiction. Michener, James Michener, he does the big, thick books, and Dalrymple, of course.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Michener, is it on? Hello? Big fan of historical fiction. Michener, James Michener,
Yes.
do you know his stuff? He really does era pieces, just big epochs, and Dalrymple. I had a question on when you brought up the Queen of Fire. You said you had more of a plethora of, information at your disposal. So you had to, select out stuff that would really ring true to maybe bring out something in the story that you found interesting. So I myself would like to know how you did that. I mean, was it a personal choice? Because, for instance, I have a very keen interest in pursuing something from Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. I think there's a huge amount of information, very underrepresented, to the point now where they're withdrawn from textbooks in Karnataka. But so it's sort of the same thing. There's a lot of information, lots of nuggets of interesting facts. But how to create that sense of a great story? How do you go about that for Queen of Fire, for instance? Thank you.
It was a sort of a personal choice, because my instinctive reaction on being asked to write this book, that was actually a book that I was asked to write. My first instinctive reaction was to say no, because there is too much we know about her. What is there about her that we don't know? And then I started asking myself the question, why am I saying that? Do I really know all there is to know about her just because there is all this information? Because in a way, she is as invisible as Prithvi Mahadevi, as Didda, because nobody really knows her as a woman, as a young person, as a human being. So that is when I made this choice, when I said, no, that is what I should be looking at, because I'm falling into the same trap that everybody is falling into, of thinking we know everything there is to know about her. This is a superwoman, that's it. Enough said. We don't need to know anymore. So I think that was what started me off. I think Lavinya behind wants to say something.
I'm going to ask a slightly different question since mine was connected. There has, in fact, been a resurgence of historical fiction, and even in media, television, OTT. There's been a lot of reimagining of historical settings and stories. So, what's your opinion on that?
So I have very mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I'm very happy that history is getting a lot of attention and people are suddenly, wanting to follow, what was happening in the past and so on and so forth. Having said that, I will warn you that what you see on the screen, whether it's a series, whether it's a movie, is possibly 98% fiction, 2% fact. please be aware of that, because I have gone to a lot of school sessions where a lot of children said, no, this actually, we have seen that series, you don't know, we know. So that kind of thing. No. And also because as you've been told, I have sold the rights of to Queen of Ice, and it is going to be made in a movie or a series, but I have already been warned that the people who have bought the rights can change the plot, can add characters, can do what they want with it. And, as my publishers warned me, the only connection that you will have with that book is your name as having written the book on which the movie was based. So please become detached right from now, because you cannot throw a fit that, it doesn't resemble anything you wrote. So as I said, I have mixed feelings, because I would like accuracy to be maintained, but then it cannot always be maintained, because these series or these movies are not always made by experts in the field. Experts are not normally roped in to help with the script and so on and so forth. So yeah, you have to be aware of that. Okay, now I have been completely shown the red flag, actually. So I've loved this session with all of you, and I hope you do get to read not just my books, but more books on historical fiction. And those of you who said you wanted to write, please go ahead. It's great fun when you actually do it. Thank you so much.